It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. This hour, we're going to listen back to an award-winning episode from October of 2025. In the months leading up to the show, autism had been in the news as a focus of U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. First, he promised exhaustive studies to identify any environmental factors that may cause autism. At the same time, he also made comments that many people in the autism community found to be offensive and derogatory. Later on, the health secretary and President Trump amplified unfounded concerns over possible connections between Tylenol and autism and vaccines and autism. Just before this show, the National Institutes for Health launched a $50 million autism data science initiative involving well-respected research institutions. We start with the facts about autism spectrum disorder, its diagnosis and treatments, and later we'll hear from Iowans in the autism community. With me now is Dr. Kristen Sohl, a Missouri-based pediatrician and a member of the American Board of Pediatrics. She specializes in working with patients with autism. Hello.
Hello, happy to be here with you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I want to start with a basic question, although I think it's not super easy to answer. What is autism spectrum disorder?
We are learning all the time more and more about what autism is. But in a nutshell, autism is a different way that we communicate and interact with each other. So, for example, we have a lot of expected ways that as people we talk to each other. Many of us might use our hands, our eyes. We may have different ways of interacting and engaging with each other. And we also have kind of expected behaviors as far as I may have interests in something that really excites me. And most of the time, I'm wanting to share that interest with others. So that's an expected behavior that we often see. But there are situations where, like in autism, people on the autism spectrum may have very focused interests, so very specific things that they like to do, and they're really not as interested in whether others enjoy that or are interested in sharing in that same topic. And so we think about those as being highly focused or areas of interest that can be very specific and aren't necessarily brought into kind of a relationship, if you will, in engaging with others. They very much are often content to explore those interests and explore those ideas and passions oftentimes all on their own. And so, what we expect as people is usually we expect that we want to engage in social partners. And so, in autism, really the crux of autism is that they have a difference. They have an unexpected way of engaging with other people. That doesn't make it wrong, it doesn't make it bad, but at the same time, it is unexpected. So, what we often do in medicine when things are not as expected, we like to label that as something. And in this case, we have labeled these unexpected differences. So, these unexpected behaviors, both around how we communicate, how autistic people communicate, and then also how they share or don't share their areas of interest. We've labeled that as autism spectrum disorder, this diagnosis, if you will, that essentially defines how people on the spectrum differ from people who are not on the autism spectrum.
And let's talk about this spectrum because I think that's something a lot of people throw out and think maybe they understand, but we'll get to some facts about it. And back in 2013, the DSM-5, that's the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders 5, was released, and in that there was a pretty big change to how autism spectrum disorder was defined. So prior to that, a lot of people used the term Asperger's to talk about people who had some of those sort of mildly autistic characteristics. That is no longer part of the conversation. So tell me what changed in 2013.
Sure. As I mentioned, we are always learning new information about how the autistic mind works. And what's really neat is that we've actually learned a lot from autistic adults as we have been better understanding their experiences as children. For example, in 2013, when that new DSM 5 came out, it was rooted in our newer understanding of how autism presents across that spectrum. So you're absolutely right. Prior to 2013, what we know from history is that frankly, autism really wasn't first defined, if you will, or fully defined until the 40s and between 1940 and 1960. And then it really didn't enter our lexicon of diagnostics until 1980. So imagine, right? We've learned a ton about autism since 1980. And so when we fast forward through DSM 3 and 4 and now 5, we were able to understand under our current constructs that autism presents in many, many ways. We may have people who are highly verbal. They have lots and lots of words and lots of things to say, but yet they still are having unexpected behaviors as it relates to how they interact with others. Similarly, we know that those that may have been defined as Asperger's under our old criteria, they also, though, have a lot of challenges or may have some challenges as it relates to emotion regulation or as it relates to feeling like they know how to have conversations with others and things like that. So the DSM 5 was intended to help us understand the spectrum and not put people on one end or the other end because the spectrum is really not linear. And that's something that's super important for people to understand that when we're talking about the spectrum, we're really looking at a multifaceted human being who may have challenges in some areas and may have huge strengths in other areas. And so that's why the DSM 5 was intending to try to broaden this concept of the spectrum. However, it's hard for humans to think about things outside of a linear context. And so I think that's kind of how we found ourselves in some of these polarizing situations, even as we sit here today.
The way we talk about autism, even in the DSM 5, with a level 1, level 2, level 3, that would lead us to think about it in a linear manner. So tell me what level 1, level 2, level 3, what do those levels mean?
First and foremost, the levels are around the level of support needed for that person to be able to meet their own goals or their family's goals for them or things like that. And so when we are doing a diagnosis, we are looking at the diagnostic criteria as outlined in the DSM 5. And then we are looking at the two categories that we are assessing specifically: social communication. So, to use pathologizing language for a minute, deficits based, we're looking at how big are the deficits that this person is experiencing related to social communication. So, we assign a level there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Then we also assign a second level for repetitive and restricted behaviors. So, those are the two criteria, the two domains within the DSM 5. Now, when you really are doing this work, what we know is that it's based on the information I have on that day, in that moment, and for that individual person. So, for example, I may be evaluating a young child who might be 2 or 3, and they may have very significant social communication delays. They may have very unexpected ways that they communicate with their mom, their dad, their siblings, their peers, and that may not be working very well for them. So, in that context, I may, as the diagnostician, say, this is a child who really has a lot of support needs, and I may define that as level 3. Really important to understand that that is in that moment, in that context, at that time. We all evolve as humans, and so it's highly likely that that will change over time. Now, also of note, we don't reassess the level at really any other point in the person's life. Could we? Sure, but that's not really how it works. So we define that level at diagnosis, and it's meant to be for that moment in time. But unfortunately, society and our communities have run with that and said, oh, my son or daughter is a level 1, or I am a level 1 autistic. That really does a lot of disservice because honestly, again, it's not meant to be prognostic. It's not meant to say, this is what this means, this is how this is portrayed, or projects into your future. It's intended to help us as clinicians outline what kind of services somebody needs. Where do we go from here? And really formulate that support and services plan that's so important for so many autistic people and their families.
Within autism spectrum disorder, the diversity of presentation and implication is really so tremendous. I mean, we can have someone with that diagnosis who, if I were interacting with them, I may never even suspect that they have a diagnosis for anything. We can also have someone who is profoundly disabled and will not be able to live independently and will need help with basic living. We will have, people who are nonverbal. There are all kinds of presentations. Just the diversity, I think, makes it difficult for people to wrap their minds around what autism means. I mean, in your practice, give me an idea of the really incredible diversity of individuals you work with.
And it really is, you said it so well, it really is incredible diversity. And that is complicated. And I think that as we as clinicians and researchers continue to grapple with this spectrum and how do we talk about such completely different experiences between those that have profound 300, 24/7, 365 needs compared to those that are, getting a PhD in neuroscience, for example, it's a real struggle. And I think from a behavioral standpoint, as again, a diagnostician and a clinician, I see the common behaviors across that spectrum, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all easily surmised as a single diagnosis. And so just yesterday, I was in clinic. I absolutely adore being in clinic with families. And very much every single time I'm in clinic, I have that experience. I had one young man who is experiencing very, very intense behavior. So, extreme physical aggression to the point where he's not able to engage with his day program currently because of very extreme physical aggression. He's minimally verbal, and a lot of other factors are playing into his day to day experience. He would be considered profound by most individuals, or some people would call that level 3. I, again, really don't love the levels. So, this is a person who right now does require 24/7 supervision in order to maintain safety. That's the definition I like to think about. But then in that same clinic session, and I was in clinic again all day yesterday. I've got kids who are, just chatty, 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 telling me all about their focused interests. And no, they don't really care about my perspective on their focused interests, but boy, are they delightful to engage with. And they are excelling in the classroom. They are able to academically perform. They do continue to have challenges with their peers often, but at the same time, very different, right? And so part of me, again, thinks about the beauty of that diversity within the spectrum, but I also recognize the functional challenges that presents to a government, for example, and helping to think about that. And I think there's a lot of challenges that this broad, broad, broad definition has presented us.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News. It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. This hour, we're listening back to an award-winning episode from October of 2025 focused on autism spectrum disorder. Back in April 2025, U.S. Health Secretary RFK Jr. promised exhaustive studies to identify any environmental factors that may cause autism. At the same time, he made some comments that felt really offensive and derogatory to a lot of people in the autism community. Here are some of those comments.
Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are children who should not be suffering like this. These are kids who, many of them were fully functional and regressed because of some environmental exposure into autism when they're 2 years old. And these are kids who will never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it.
Again, those are the comments of RFK Jr. in April of 2025. In the months that followed, there were a lot more conversations about autism in the news, and then the National Institutes for Health launched a $50 million autism data science initiative involving some investment in some well-respected institutions. Right now, we are talking about facts. Dr. Kristen Sohl is a Missouri-based pediatrician and a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Sohl, just before the break, we were talking about the incredible diversity among people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. One of the things that Secretary Kennedy did say, he says this is an epidemic in this country. And we have seen a pretty radical increase in the number of children getting diagnosed with autism. Now, just a few minutes ago, we talked about how in 2013, the way we diagnose autism, the way we label autism changed dramatically. So that is one of the reasons that we've seen a big increase in autism diagnoses. But according to the Centers for Disease Control, 1 out of 31 children in the United States is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That's from 2022. So that's a pretty high number. What are some of the other reasons we've seen those diagnoses increase?
Sure. When we look across the relatively short history of autism, it's important to reflect on the fact that just in 2006, that was the first time that the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with the universal recommendation that all children at 18 and 24-month well-child visits should be screened for autism. And that's an important date in this timeline. So prior to that, you may or may not have had someone who was in the primary care space that understood even a little about what autism was. And so in 2006, when that recommendation came out, that meant many, many, many more people were screening for questions about autism. Now, I don't think that accounts for everything. And like you've said, this is a multifactorial evolution that we're seeing. We've had a sizable increase in the understanding related to autism and also how we support autistic people to thrive in their communities. One of the points that I think is important to understand is that prior to around 2000, 2005, we really didn't have a whole lot to offer. So we had diagnoses. Often it was a very limited perspective or a limited set of characteristics that would be identified as being on the spectrum. Often people couldn't access many of at the time, evidence-based research-based interventions such as applied behavioral analysis. So in 2007, the very first state passed legislation saying that medical insurance, needed to cover this type of medically necessary intervention. That was 2007. And the 50th state passed that same type of legislation in 2019. So when we look at the timeline of autism, I am not suggesting that we don't need to continue asking ourselves, what is going on with our children? How are we supporting their development? How are we thinking about what we know and what we don't know about autism? But I am suggesting that there are contemporary issues, not just in the diagnostic manual, but also kind of in the practice of medicine and in the practice of essentially what's covered and not covered within our insurance paradigm that have absolutely influenced the prevalence of autism.
So I hear you saying is that there can be benefits and support if you get an autism diagnosis now. And in the past, if you didn't get anything because of that diagnosis and there was a stigma attached to getting that diagnosis, that there actually could have been a disincentive to even seek a diagnosis.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Now that more people are getting diagnosed and there are more supports, there have been a lot of conversations about, okay, where is this coming from? So what do we know about where autism is coming from?
We know that autism is absolutely linked to genetics. We know that autism tends to run in families, but we still have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn about the influence of our environment on our genetics. That's a field called epigenetics. And I think that when I think about the $50 million investment by the federal government in better understanding the links to autism and how our genes are influenced by our environment, that's an exciting time. That's $50 million that we didn't previously have to better understand sound science and how that applies to the linkages around autism and how autistic people can be better understood and how we can support them.
When autism is diagnosed, we do know that there are many therapies and supports that can help an individual manage some of the challenges that they may encounter. Thinking beyond that to treatments, is that even an applicable term in this case?
Great question, and also one that we all grapple with. Autism, many people feel strongly that autism is a spectrum of neurodiversity, just like we have millions of types of plants and millions of types of animals, many people feel very strongly that autism is a part of this neurodiversity that is the human brain. And so when we look at it through that lens and we understand that perspective, these ideas of treatment feel a little bit funny, right? Because it's like, wait a minute, what are you treating? And yet at the same time, when we think about the profound needs of some people who are on the autism spectrum, we know that we must do better in serving them and serving them well so that they can stay safe, that they're able to be included in their communities, whether that's in recreational settings, whether that's in classroom settings. We don't have the right supports in place for many people who do have significant support needs. So, does it make sense that people are saying, well, how do we treat that in that traditional sense of treatment? But I like to think about it differently than that. How can I, as a researcher and a clinician, build supports that are individualized at the space of that human and help them to thrive within the context of their community? That might be their family, that might be their town or their city. But how do we build that? And how do we have the resources to support them, again, to stay safe, to be included meaningfully, and really helps to advance our understanding of human diversity? So that's not to say that we are discounting the true needs of individuals on the spectrum, but when it comes down to can we cure it, can we treat it, things like that, those are concepts that I really don't buy into. And I think it's important for us as a society to recognize that every one of us thinks differently. Every one of us has different support needs in our day to day lives. And how can we apply that same logic to autism? And when there are high support needs, what do we have to offer? And how do we help keep that aim, that goal of including people on the spectrum in meaningful ways into our society? I think that's what we have to ask ourselves. Not so much how can we fix somebody, or how can we undo the things that are unexpected about them, but how can we include them in the ways that they naturally interact in being successful in a way that's meaningful to that family and to that human being that we're working with?
You mentioned families, and of course, when somebody does have profound needs, that also profoundly affects their family and the people who give them care and support them if they possibly can. Does that create tension in the autism community that there are some families that face very, very different and even extreme challenges compared to other families that may even feel pride in an ASD diagnosis because this is something that makes an individual unique. Does that create tension?
Huge tension. And this is something that in the exam room when I am my clinician self, there's not much tension because I get to work individually with that family and that person and help to craft and create a support a series of supports and services that make sense for that family. But man, when you zoom out into that broader community, there's a lot of really intense, passionate perspectives. And I think that's exactly what I would encourage people to think. It's perspective. So if I'm an autistic adult, which I'm not, but I very much may feel like, hey, this is who I am. And the way that I think and the way that I engage with my peers or my coworkers is really unique and really exciting, and I'm proud of that. And that's okay. That's a great perspective to have. But it's also an equally valid perspective to be the mom, the sister, the dad, the best friend, the spouse to someone who has really high intense needs. And maybe that has ebbed and flowed over time. And yes, I did say spouse to someone with high intense needs because that is possible. And yet it often doesn't happen because our society is not set up to support a person with high intense needs to receive the services that they need. So when I think about the families that are fighting day in, day out, frankly, minute to minute, to keep their child safe and to keep their loved one um, moving forward, that is a real perspective. And it's very difficult for someone with minimal support needs or someone who is very proud of their autism diagnosis to truly reflect on what it would look like to every minute be thinking about how to keep someone safe because they can't keep themselves safe. And so I think those perspectives are very polarizing. What I wish that I could share with anyone with either of those perspectives or anyone in the between is that we each have our own perspectives and each perspective is valid. and it's worthy of a conversation. And so, yes, I'm well aware of the fighting that happens, and I really wish we could just take a step back and acknowledge that those perspectives are valid, whichever perspective you take.
There is a lot of misinformation about autism out there, and a lot of that has been amplified recently. Where do you send people to get good, solid information when they have questions?
It's tricky. I obviously would love for everyone to be connected to a physician or a clinician or a psychologist or a teacher, anybody who had great understanding about autism. And unfortunately, there aren't enough of us who really are invested in building our professional careers around autism. And so I think, sure, there are reputable resources through various organizations, nonprofits, things like that. I like some of the work that's being done by our Autism Science Foundation. I like some of the work that's being done by Autism Speaks, as well as Profound Autism Alliance. I like many of those things, but I have found that there's really no single best place to go. And that's really difficult. And I think that creates a lot of the telephone game that we see play out in our communities, because it's like, oh, well, I don't like what they said, and I do like what they said. Well, okay, that is what it is. What I would encourage people to do is try to get connected to people, professionals who have a good, solid understanding. One of the big areas of focus of my work is trying to create more access to those best practices, whether that be community pediatricians, whether that be community therapists, whatever, so that families, when they're seeking answers, people, when they're learning about themselves and how their autistic mind works, they can go to a professional who can be a resource to them. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Dr. Kristen Soul, thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for spending time talking about this.
Dr. Kristen Soul is a Missouri based pediatrician and member of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We've been talking about autism spectrum disorder. Approximately 5.4 million adults in the United States have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. For people who live with autism, how does this national discourse affect them? Tyler Leach is a Des Moines man with autism. He's a former board member of the Autism Society of Iowa and founder of the Barefoot Autism Challenge. He also works at Wells Fargo and has for the past 10 years or so. Hello, Tyler.
Hello, Charity.
It's wonderful to talk to you. And Tyler, I mean, you were diagnosed with autism before you were 2 years old. So this has always been a part of who you are. What was it like for you when you were growing up?
At first, I started out talking like any normal baby would. Around the time I was diagnosed, I lost my language, and it was hard for me to fully communicate with some of the things that I needed. But with the right speech therapists and enough practicing, I was able to regain my speech, as you could tell.
Yeah.
And for a while, I just thought I was a normal, average kid. I didn't think anything about autism until around sixth grade, when my mom and I had a conversation about it. And I was totally okay with it. I just thought it was something that was just a part of me.
And it is. And I know your mom has been an incredible advocate and a great mother for you for all these years. And did you feel, thinking back, do you feel like you got the support you needed in school?
Yes, I do. With the IEPs and meeting with the teachers to share my specific needs.
You have dedicated a lot of your adult life to advocacy and raising awareness. What do you want people to know about people who live with autism?
Autism is nothing wrong with you. I know there may be some people who may look on you with pity, but there will be people who will be in your corner for your needs, and other people are going to be like, I'm not alone and I can do stuff even with autism.
What has it been like for you to hear things like some of the things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been saying? For example, that he said autism destroys families. What does that feel like when you hear that?
It kind of made me cringe a little. I know that there are the severe autistic people, and it's a lot more challenging on those ends, but it doesn't necessarily tear families apart by any means. In a way, it could teach those families to be stronger.
Tyler, thank you so much for talking to me.
You're welcome.
Tyler Leach is a former board member of the Autism Society of Iowa and founder of the Barefoot Autism Challenge. In a moment, I'll talk with Wendy Anderson, mother of 2 children with autism. She's also a board member of the Autism Society of Iowa. This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News. It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. This hour, we're listening back to an award-winning episode from October of 2025. In April of that year, U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. promised exhaustive studies to identify any environmental factors that may cause autism. At the same time, he also made comments that many people with autism and those who love them found to be offensive and derogatory. Earlier in the program, we focused on facts about autism, its diagnosis and treatment. We also want to hear from people who have firsthand knowledge of what it's like to live with autism. My next guest is Wendy Anderson. She is an Autism Society of Iowa board member. She lives in Trainer, Iowa, a small town in western Iowa, and 2 of her 3 children have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Hello, Wendy.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I want to talk about your kids. So you have 3 kids. Tell me a little bit about your family.
My husband and I, we have 3 children. Our son, Dexter, is a junior. He was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder called tuberous sclerosis when he was 6 months old, epilepsy, and autism when he was about 5. Phoebe is a 6th grader. She's severely dyslexic, has an autism diagnosis, and she was diagnosed when she was 10. And Brexley is a 4th grader. And they say in our household, Brexley doesn't have any diagnoses yet. So we've just tried to normalize it, get information about ourselves.
So let's talk about Dexter, because obviously it was pretty clear early on that Dexter was dealing with some serious challenges. And you mentioned the tuberous sclerosis. This is a rare genetic disorder. About 1 in 6,000 people are born with this. But about 50% of individuals also develop autism?
Yes. So tuberous sclerosis is the leading genetic cause for autism. And so, yeah, about 50% of individuals with a TS diagnosis will also be diagnosed with autism.
You mentioned that he was diagnosed when he was about 5 years old. Can you tell me what was going on? What led up to that diagnosis and your seeking the diagnosis?
Yeah, he has been in therapies for most of his life, and he had a speech delay. And so we were private paying for a speech therapist because insurance would not cover his speech therapy because he didn't have a covered diagnosis, even though TS was a diagnosis for him. And so he, with that speech delay, social challenges, very friendly kid, loves to hug, but just to have those social interactions was challenging, regulation. And so one day, the speech therapist was like, have you ever considered that maybe he might have autism? And we were like, well, yeah, it's highly likely with the 50% statistic. And so us too, looking at the characteristics and then combine that with the fact that our insurance wouldn't cover some of his therapies because he didn't have an autism diagnosis, really kind of just pushed us to go seek out and get the diagnosis.
And we talked earlier in the program with a doctor, so we've covered autism spectrum disorder and the different levels of diagnosis. Where does Dexter fall on that level scale? Level 1, level 2, level 3?
Yeah, Dexter would be like a level 2, maybe 2.5. At the time, they didn't have levels that he got a diagnosis, but He's probably a level 2. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's somebody who's going to need a lot of help through life.
Yes. He will never live on his own. Mhm.
When you got that diagnosis when he was 5, how did that change things?
Yeah, for us, the shock of a diagnosis for us came when he was 6 months old. And so for us getting an autism diagnosis at 5, we're like, that just gives us more information and more resources and information that we can seek out to help him. So we weren't necessarily shocked at 5, but more of a relief that, yes, what we're seeing is actually autism.
When you got that diagnosis, did that make the change that you were hoping that it would make? That did you get your speech therapy covered by insurance, for example?
Yes, we did actually get the therapies covered by insurance because he had that diagnosis.
Tell me about some of the challenges of having a child with these challenges and living in a small town.
It is very challenging. We moved to that town because my husband is from there. When we were going to enroll him into kindergarten, of course, we were having lots of meetings with the school. And being in a small school, they just weren't equipped to help him and to be able to provide the appropriate education that he needs. So at one point, we actually open enrolled him into a neighboring school because it was a larger school and they could provide more services to him.
Okay, so that involved driving a lot more.
Yeah.
And again, Dexter's one of 3. He's 4
Yes.
years older than Phoebe, but that makes for a lot of challenges, doesn't it?
It really does, because then fast forward to, last year, it was just clearly evident that school also could not provide for him. So we actually ended up enrolling him into Madonna Ability Alliance in Omaha as a school that he could really thrive in, and he has for the last 2 years. So, yeah, we drive him into school 35 minutes, depending on traffic, every day. So it does provide a lot of technicality challenges with the number of therapies that he has, schools, and just provides a unique situation where we do a lot of divide and conquer in our house.
Sure. And parents of 3 tend to, but you guys have even more responsibilities in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that we've learned this hour is that every ASD diagnosis, of course, represents an individual, and autism presents itself differently in different people. Your daughter, Phoebe, also has an ASD diagnosis, but this is a very different situation. Tell me a little bit about Phoebe.
Yeah, Phoebe, if we were probably just sitting in a room, you might not even notice it. Along the years, we learned that she was severely dyslexic. She was a 2-month preemie. And so we knew, just developmentally, things might have been a little bit delayed. And so being in the autism world, I was watching a lot of, seminars and things on girls and autism and how they just present so differently. And there were just some differences that we had noticed in Phoebe. Definitely like the repetitive nature, but in a different way that was in our son. And communication challenges, but once she got to know you, you could have a conversation. And so we really were able to sit down with Dr. Menasak and just have a conversation and say, okay, here's the DSM criteria. This is what it looks like for her. What do you think? And so that's really how that conversation came about with her, because she can communicate with you. She's extremely athletic in sports. Everyday life, quote unquote, she, functions very well. And so it is very different.
So with Phoebe, what do you feel are the benefits of the diagnosis?
Oh, it's a great question. One of the things that we see, she's very detail oriented. And she sees things and solve problems in ways that none of us think of. So many times if we have a challenge in our house that we can't figure out, we're like, hey, what do you think about this? Or organizing things. Her brain just sees the world so differently. And so it's kind of fun to see how she processes it and what the outcome of that is.
Has getting that diagnosis given her treatment, therapy, an IEP, things that you feel that she needed that she wasn't getting?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So with that diagnosis, we were also able to get her into occupational therapy and speech therapy. So the occupational therapy has been so instrumental in like helping her to regulate herself and the anxiety that she may have, not feeling like she fits into the world and how she sees the world in different ways. And skills and speech therapy, again, just opening up those communication lines and teaching some of those skills. And yes, absolutely, we were able to get her on an IEP also.
So, one of the things that may have something to do with a pretty radical increase in ASD diagnoses is the lifting of stigma. And people were avoiding a diagnosis for a long time because they were afraid of the stigma of being autistic. Do you feel like there's a liability for Phoebe in having this diagnosis?
I really wouldn't say it's a liability. And I do think the decreasing of the stigma has been extremely helpful in that it really helps people to understand what's going on. Once we have the knowledge to understand her brain, then we're able to help her navigate the world.
So let's go back to April when Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was making these announcements saying that he is promising to fund these studies to identify any environmental factors that may cause autism. And as I said earlier, at the same time, he also made some comments that some people in the autism community took a lot of offense to, saying that autism destroys families and it's destroying our most precious resource, which are our children. What was your reaction in April?
Honestly, it made me really sad. And I was most sad about the ignorance of the statements that I feel like. Our children are our most precious resources. And if we can see them as the amazing humans that they are, I think that's where the focus needs to be. Destroying families, it is challenging. We're very grateful for our children and where they are. And there are lots of families who are really, really struggling for autism. But I'm like, if we had more resources for our families and more services available without having to put up a massive fight, then maybe there would be less destroying of families. So I really feel like he completely missed the mark and almost started to put blame on the families for this.
I do have a friend who has a child with an ASD diagnosis, and that child heard the statement and asked his mother, "Did I destroy our family?" And I know with the work that you do with the Autism of Society of Iowa, you work with a lot of families with autism in their families. How do you feel about what children are hearing?
Yeah, it's damaging, right? Because not only are they navigating a world that maybe their brain sees differently, but now we have a public official who is making decisions about their care saying they've destroyed the family. And so again, that's placing guilt and shame on a child or on a family member where guilt and shame doesn't need to be placed. Like, you are the unique human that they are, and let's love you for who you are.
On the other hand, any disease that we have in our society, a focus and a promise of money and funding and scientific resources, that can be a very positive thing. Do you feel like there's an upside to this focus?
Yeah, I feel like there's an upside to the focus of putting more money into research if it's pure research, and that it's not research being not scientifically done looking for a specific outcome. It's like if you put money into a study on whether Tylenol caused autism and that's the outcome that you wanted, it's, no surprise you're going to get that outcome. So yes, I think there isn't a parent out there that isn't like, is there something else that we can learn? And so I think good scientific research, there's definitely some benefits to it. And there's been a lot of research done, so not dismissing the research that has been done.
Well, and speaking of research, RFK Jr. has also amplified some bad research, blaming ASD on vaccines, on Tylenol usage among pregnant women, or even on its use following circumcision. And, you know, I hope that we've all read enough and listened to enough to understand the nuances of these claims. How do you feel when you hear that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of guilt and shame again that keeps getting put on parents.
Like it was your fault.
Yes, very early on, it was the refrigerator moms. And unfortunately, I feel like we're going back that way. Like, you decided to circumcise your child and give them Tylenol, or you decided to take Tylenol when you're pregnant, and now you've caused that. We have enough guilt and worries as it is as parents when with a diagnosis or without a diagnosis. And so I just think that's really amplifying it and saying like, hey, this is all your fault.
The other thing that we've seen since the Trump administration has taken office are changes to Medicaid. And we're also just about to see possibly an increase in the amount of money that it will cost people to be a part of the ACA. And so that's going to make it harder for some people to get health care in the autism community. Do you know people who are losing services, or is there a lot of fear about that?
There is a lot of fear about it, and it's real because, yes, they already are losing services. I've talked to several families, whether it's in the hours of the ABA therapy, respite hours are being decreased. Just the other day, therapy was, your child needs to be on in-home therapy, said the insurance company, meaning you go to the occupational therapist, they give you a program, and now you just do that at home. So now parents, in addition to parenting, working, caregiving, now you're the occupational therapist or the physical therapist or the ABA. And so it's this decrease of funding, that's what's going to be detrimental and devastating to families.
What do you want people to know? If you've got some ears right now, what do you want to say to people about autism?
Yeah, I think we all need to take a breath. But also, like, when you take a chance to see an individual for the human that they are, like when you get that chance to really see the beauty in them, take it. Because an autistic individual sees the world through a different lens than I'd ever seen, than you've ever seen, and it can be so amazing and so beautiful. So take the chance to really get to know them and see the world through their eyes.
Wendy, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Wendy Anderson is an Autism Society of Iowa board member. She lives in Trainer, Iowa, and 2 of her 3 children have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Talk of Iowa is a production of IPR News. This episode was produced by Caitlin Troutman. I'm Charity Nebbe.